I'm picking up now in the middle of the story of Herod Antipas, Herodias, and Herodias's daughter. And the reason I'm picking up in the middle of it is simply because I'm originally recording this YouTube video for my doctoral students because I need to miss a class. And so I'm recording material for them. And this is where we left off last time. So I apologize for those of you for whom this is the middle of the story, but this is from Mark 6, and you can read the whole thing in the Bible, which is actually way better than hearing it from me. But I can give you some background on it that may be useful to you. So, um, Herod Antipas says, "Ask me for whatever you wish." Now, that's a very extravagant promise. I mean, it would be like one of my kids coming to me and asking me for, "Give me $1 billion." I'm like, I love you. I would be happy to help you, but I don't have $1 billion. So whatever you wish, that's kind of extravagant. Powerful figures in antiquity sometimes made promises that they later regretted. You have that in the story of the Greek god Zeus with Semele. You may know that Zeus in Greek mythology had lots of affairs. He was chasing women, chasing girls, raping them, having affairs with them. And his wife, Hera, was always getting jealous, except when he had an affair with Ganymede, apparently, who was a boy. But as long as it was girls, Hera was very jealous and took it out on the women who were often innocent. Well, the story of Semele, not quite so innocent. She's boasting, "Hey, I I get to make love with Zeus." So Hera comes to her in disguise and says, "Oh, you say it's Zeus, but how do you know it's really Zeus? Maybe it's just somebody pretending to be Zeus, taking advantage of you. Now, say, if you're really Zeus, I want you to promise me that you will reveal yourself to me in the same splendor with which you mate with Hera." And so Semele says to Zeus, "Promise me whatever I ask for." He says, "You can have anything, darling." She says, "I want to see you in your splendor, like the way you look when you mate with Hera." He said, "Oh, I wish you hadn't asked that, but for honor's sake, I have to keep my promise." It turns into a lightning bolt. She's vaporized, but happily, even though she's pregnant with this child, he doesn't let the child be vaporized. He snatches that out of her womb and sews it onto his hide, and then eventually it springs out whole as Dionysus. Not quite as nice as the story of where he has this awful headache and gets Hephaestus to split open his head with an axe, and out pops Athena, full grown and in full armor. Talk about a splitting headache. Well, anyway, that's enough for Greek mythology. But actually, in a variety of other sources, narrative sources, historical sources, um, often about things that happened a long time before, so we're not sure how many of them are entirely accurate. But Persian and other Eastern kings were known in Greek literature for making extravagant promises. Sometimes they regretted them, but they still fulfilled them for honor's sake. More often, uh, everybody knew that they didn't mean them literally, but if somebody was so stupid as to take it as meaning it literally, sometimes the promised recipient experienced some fatal accident or somehow disappeared from public view shortly after the promise. So he says, "Ask me anything." But the one who really has much greater authority than the so called king, the fake king, Herod Antipas, he wasn't a king like his father Herod the Great, he was a tetrarch, a governor. But the real king, Jesus, later on, two of his disciples ask him, "We want you to do for us whatever we want." And Jesus wisely asks them, "What is it that you want?" And not everything we ask for is actually good for us, including in the case that they're about to ask for. Well, King Herod offers to give away half his kingdom. Now, he's obviously drunk at this point, just like Ahasuerus, Achashverosh, Xerxes in most translations is in Esther chapter 1. But also, Greek philosophers often spoke of, the true royalty, the true kingship is to have control of yourself. Proverbs actually talks about that as well when it says that stronger is the one who controls their own spirit than the one who takes a city. Well, this king in this story is enslaved by passion. Ancient sources depict this as a deplorable weakness, and they often talk about kings who couldn't control their passions and brought all sorts of trouble on themselves and their family. Proverbs 31:3 also says, "Don't give your strength to women, your ways to those who destroy kings." Or in a more positive vein, First Esdras says, "Who rules over kings? Who has mastery over them? Isn't it women?" And you probably remember the biblical stories of Samson and Solomon, where they got themselves into a lot of trouble. Samson kept thinking, "No, I won't give way to this temptation. I know every time I tell her what will take away my strength, she does it." And then afterwards she says, "Samson, you lied to me. You should tell me how to kill you." But finally he gives in, like mastered by his passion. Anyway, he's not just offering this daughter to be his eventual heir, which that could make sense, although she's Herodias's daughter. There's some debate about the textual variant, but that was in the material that we covered before this material. But he's promising her like half his kingdom. Right now, as a tetrarch, Herod doesn't own his kingdom. Rome does. Herod had no authority to give away anything of his kingdom. So she needs to ask for something more doable and practical. And this up to half my kingdom, it echoes what King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes in many translations, says to Esther. What's your request? It'll be given to you, up to half my kingdom. And then at a banquet, very fittingly, she says it, he says it to her another time. So these lines would be familiar to a Jewish audience because they'd hear them every year at Purim. And most of the Gentile Christians in Mark's audience either would have heard about that from the Jewish Christian teachers in the audience or from those who heard it from them, since the earliest teachers in the church, the ones who knew the Bible best, were then those who had grown up in the synagogue. But whereas Esther, when she's given the opportunity to request something, she requests the life of her people. Here, Herodias's daughter requests instead the death of a prophet. Now, why did she go out to ask her mother? Well, one of the most common views is that all this took place in the palace Machaerus, which was a fortress of Herod the Great, and now under the control of his son, most of the time, under the control of his son, Herod Antipas. Well, Machaerus apparently had a dungeon. Josephus, first century Jewish historian, tells us that that's where John the Baptist was imprisoned. So it makes sense that this banquet takes place at that palace at Machaerus. And Machaerus, archaeology shows, like most palaces, had separate banquet halls. Well, at least most palaces in the Eastern Mediterranean had separate banqueting halls, presumably, as in the book of Esther, separate banqueting halls for men and women. Herodias, therefore, wasn't present to witness Herod's drunken lust after her daughter. But she goes out and gets advice from her mom, who already had something in mind and had just been waiting for the opportunity, which has now come. Although the daughter seems rather overeager herself, immediately she rushed back to the king and requested, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist." That's what her mother asked for, on a platter. it's already kind of grotesque. Anyway, you've got two honorable woman characters in 521 to 43. One, Thugater and Coracion, that is a daughter and a young woman. Here, we also have a daughter, a young woman, but it's going to look different. This honorable woman in chapter 7, she begs Jesus on behalf of her daughter to set her daughter free. But in between these two passages where you've got these honorable women who are following, seeking Jesus, seeking for help, and another case of a father there seeking help for his daughter, you've got two conniving women here. So even though the women disciples in Mark chapter 15, verses 40 and 41, come off looking better than the male disciples who had fled already in 1450, women are also imperfect, as you'll see in chapter 16 and verse 8, at least according to the majority understanding of that passage. But anyway, they're getting around male privilege, but as members of the elite themselves, they hold enough power to get someone killed. So, I mean, you can think of the Old Testament. Rebecca gets around Isaac to help Jacob because she heard from God that the elder would serve the younger. I mean, there are cases where people got around things, but here it's not for a good purpose. It's for a rather explicitly bad purpose. On a platter was a large flat dish. And grotesquely, John's head is presented as if it's meat on a dish with plenty of gore undoubtedly dripping from it. This generates associations with cannibalism. It's not literally cannibalism. Nobody eats the head, but that's what it could look like. But it's practical. If she's going to have to give it to her mother, it's less bloody to carry it on or have somebody else carry it on one of the dinner utensils than to get her whatever she's wearing filthy with it. Anyway, but it's also an ancient trope, and maybe even especially in historical works. So, there's some things. Herod Antipas, he may be drunk. Probably he's drunk. He knows the story of Esther. He may be echoing lines from the king there. Certainly Mark wants us to understand that because of the different allusions there. But also, people with unlimited power sometimes repeat the same kind of actions. So you've got people in power in ancient sources who kill someone to entertain or impress a woman or a girl or a boy with whom they're enamored. And this had already happened once in Jewish history. Josephus tells us about a Jewish king who, with his concubines around, had 600 men crucified. It's always, while the concubines were around him at a banquet, it's always depicted as horrifying and grotesque in ancient sources. Here again are some of the pictures. I used a number of pictures from Todd Boland's Bible pictures with his permission for in my classes. Well, here's a platter with other dishes from first century Jerusalem, although this one's not taking place in Jerusalem. It's taking place either in Galilee or more likely in Perea at the fortress Machaerus. Here's a platter made of stone from roughly this period. Now, this practice had known precedent even in Judean history. This is the passage in Josephus that talks about this in Josephus's Antiquities. The king, it says, and again calling him king, was deeply grieved. He thought, I hate for this to happen, but he wasn't deeply grieved enough to change course. It's the misery of sin without repentance. He could have been deeply grieved and said, well, I'll be more deeply grieved if I kill John, because we know from earlier in the passage that he liked listening to him, but he's not deeply grieved enough to change course. So you can compare how Paul speaks of godly grief producing repentance that leads to life, worldly grief producing death. You can think of in the end of Matthew 26, or actually just the first part of Matthew 27. Yeah, end of 26, Peter just pours out his heart with tears in sorrow. Judas is sorrowful for what he's done and then goes and hangs himself. That's not a repentance to life, that's a repentance to death. Um, and you have things about lupe, grief, commonly in ancient moralists, ancient thinkers talking about this. But anyway, um, the cognate noun lupeo, grieve, appears elsewhere in Mark with the rich ruler, or the rich guy who's shocked and goes away grieving because he decides not to follow Jesus. And that's a case where the grief doesn't bring repentance. And then you have the disciples themselves being grieved when he says, you're gonna abandon me. But there's another more heroic use of this verb in Mark. Uh, actually, of this noun in Mark. I like to see a typo, but I wrote it wrong. Anyway, Mark 14:34, and he said to them, my soul is deeply grieved, even to the point of death. Remain here and keep awake. But Jesus goes through with what his Father has called him to do. And this language of his soul being deeply grieved echoes the Septuagint version, the Greek version of the Old Testament, for Psalm 41, the chorus, 41 and 42, the chorus there. So Herod Antipas goes through with executing John on account of his oaths and his dinner guests. Human oaths do not come across positively in the New Testament. Better to avoid them. We do see a cognate of this word for oaths elsewhere in Mark's Gospel. In Mark chapter 5, verse 7, the guy who's demonized with a legion of demons, the legion cries out, or the lead demon cries out, I adjure you, or kidzo, I put you under oath, so you have to do what I say. By God. So trying to magically control Jesus, obviously it doesn't work. And the nerve of a demon to invoke Jesus' own Father to keep from being cast out, demon's kind of desperate there. But this oath that Herod Antipas has made, because it involves somebody being killed, which is morally wrong, I mean, especially if it's a prophet, that's the kind of oath that just about all Jewish teachers would agree you could be released from. Of course, in Mark chapter 7, we're going to hear about what kind of vows you can be released from. And Jesus actually believes you should be released from wrong vows, immoral vows. Actually, the later Pharisees agreed with him, but apparently these particular Pharisees, that wasn't quite their practice. But anyway, so he'd promised this in public. His honor was at stake, just like Persian kings who were unable to rescind decrees in the book of Daniel or the book of Esther. As far as we know, of course, we have a lot of sources missing, but as far as we can tell from other sources, it wasn't illegal for them to rescind their decrees, but it would be a matter of great dishonor to rescind their decrees. So Herod Antipas would rather kill John than lose face before the Galilean elite that he ruled. So here he's acting subservient to people who are not his peers, but his subordinates, just like he's acting subordinate ultimately to his wife and her daughter, after whom he's incestuously lusted. There are different views on that we mentioned before, but probably this wasn't merely a dance recital. The majority of scholars think, yes, probably it was more like the kind of dance that uh, produced this kind of reaction in Herod. Anyway, um, the other use of that verb in Mark is when Jesus is announcing his betrayal. So, what happens to John the Baptist actually prefigures, in many respects, what's going to happen to Jesus in somewhat different ways. But Pilate is also going to find himself outmaneuvered by others. So, the king gives orders. Now he's acting like a king. He's giving orders. Epitasso, he gives orders to murder the prophet. And we know from 6:14 to 16, Herod speaks of John, whom I killed. That is, he recognizes it's his responsibility ultimately. He didn't have to do this. Now, you can contrast Mark's other uses of the verb epitasso, giving orders, for the real king. He has authority over even demons in Mark 1:27 and 9:25. And you see it especially in the following context, where Jesus gives orders to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. For what? So he can feed them. He's not producing the head of a prophet to be killed at a banquet on a platter. He's providing food for all his dinner guests, not the great noble people of Galilee who work for Herod Antipas, but for all the people who'd gathered, most of them undoubtedly poor, since that was the status of most people in Galilee, well, at least by our standards today. And there's some debate about how poor, but by modern standards, well, even of course by modern standards, even the elite didn't have air conditioning. But notice the voices highlighted or silenced within the story. John's prophetic voice appears only in the pre-narrative, where he denounces the adulterous and incestuous relationship of Herod Antipas with Herodias. Incestuous, partly because she's his niece, but mainly because she's his brother's wife. And they divorced, but John doesn't regard this divorce as a valid divorce. And we'll talk more about valid divorces when we get to Mark chapter 10, where some people are trying apparently to maneuver Jesus into the setting of John so Jesus can get in more trouble with Herod. And the people who are trying to do that are the same people who conspired with Herodians in chapter 3 and verse 6 to get rid of him. So anyway, John the Baptist is silenced in this tale of wickedness, the main figures. This is what's done to John rather than by John. And we can compare the Passion narrative in Mark, where Jesus' voice grows progressively more silent. Sin takes advantage of sin. Herodias' sin exploits Herod's sin. And yeah, there are plenty of times when this has happened, where persecutors harm Christians where Christians are minority, and then Western secularists sometimes say that's what Christians get for being so imperialistic historically, sometimes twisting the historical record and sometimes dealing with things that were done in the name of Christ that were really wrong. But I mean, these are people who are innocent, who are, anyway, pastors' sexual sins becoming excuses for unbelief in Christ, whatever. Sin taking advantage of sin. So John gets decapitated. This was actually the more merciful form of execution used for Roman citizens and so on. Certainly, it was a lot more efficient and speedy than crucifixion, which was normally death by slow torture. It could take 3 days to finish dying. Jesus' death is so short that Pilate is amazed by how short it is on the cross. You weren't supposed to die that fast. They wanted you to suffer longer. So, but that's once he had finished his mission, the Father receives him. But his John's disciples risk their own necks to come bury him. They don't know that Herod Antipas probably wouldn't give them trouble, but They risk their own necks to come bury him. They're more courageous than Jesus' own disciples a few chapters later. So, whatever happened to Antipas and Herodias? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us, but biblical principles played out. Adultery never pays. And so we learn about that from Josephus, actually, the first century Jewish historian who lived during this time, and especially in the decades afterwards. But John's disciples bury his body in a tomb. They don't have his head, but they can bury the rest of his body. Normally, burying was the responsibility of the eldest son, but John has presumably foregone marriage for the kingdom, uh, unless he had a wife like Crates' wife Hipparchia in Cynic tradition. He's probably not going to, he probably wasn't married. Isaiah, his wife was a prophetess. She could put up with stuff, but, you know, most people, male or female, wouldn't be able to live the lifestyle that John was living. But anyway, that's another story. So his disciples take on this role, and actually we know that for some other teachers in antiquity, where their disciples would take care of their burial, or in one case the community. He was really well respected, and the whole community of Athens took care of his burial, even though he said he'd rather be eaten by animals so he'd be useful in his death to somebody. But anyway, another story. So this raises the expectation, though John's disciples do this for Jesus, this raises the expectation that Jesus' disciples will surely do the same for him. And yet, when it comes time for that, all of them deserted him and fled. And Joseph of Arimathea has to take over the role, rather than the disciples who've been traveling around with him. Now, this is going to highlight the failure of Jesus' disciples. And this is the traditional tomb of John the Baptist in Samaria. Now, from Josephus, we learn the aftermath of the adulterous marriage. Herod Antipas was tetrarch, or governor. He minded his own business, kept Rome happy, and stayed in power for a whole generation, because Herod the Great died in 4 BCE. So right after that, his kingdom is divided, although Rome doesn't trust any of his sons yet to be kings. But Herod Antipas gets Galilee and Perea, the area across the Jordan. But he's not a king, he's just a tetrarch, he's a governor. Although locally, people in Galilee, he was the closest thing to a king they had. He had a palace, so people may have thought of him that way, but he wasn't really a king, not a real one. He stayed in power for a whole generation till the time of John the Baptist, when he had an affair with his brother's wife, Herodias. He liked her so much he wanted her to marry him. He probably, that was probably more premeditated than drunken lust. She was related to Herod the Great as well. She was the granddaughter of Herod the Great, but not only that, she was the granddaughter of Herod the Great and Mariamne, the Maccabean princess. And people still had fond memories of the Maccabean dynasty. So, hey, he marries her. That automatically legitimizes him more with his people. And for her, she's married to a Herod who's not really apparently politically ambitious, or at least not effective in advancing politically. But for her to marry, who was also her uncle, by the way, a brother of Herod Antipas. But now she can marry Herod Antipas, who's a generation older than her, probably should not be very attracted to him. Physically, we don't know, but politically, this would be great for her, right? But he already was married, just like she was, and that was a bit of a complication. Now, as a man, under Jewish law at that time, he was allowed to be married to more than one wife, but she's a princess, and she's schooled in Hellenistic culture, and their monogamy was the norm, although people often had concubines or committed adultery on the side, but you could only marry one person as a full-fledged wife. Well, She refused to be married to a polygamist, and Antipas decided he was going to have to divorce his first wife. Unfortunately for Antipas, she was a princess too, the daughter of King Aretas IV of the Nabateans. You hear about him in 2 Corinthians 11:32 or so, where Paul was let down in a basket from the wall because the uh, the Nabatean ethnarch in Damascus, who was under the authority ultimately of the Nabatean king Aretas, was after Paul. So anyway, this princess flees back to the fortress Machaerus, actually, and then flees to Nabatea to her father to complain, and this caused some political military problems. She refused to take this insult sitting down. She said, "I didn't do anything wrong," and she was right about that, at least in terms of what biblically would be, well, what Jesus would consider grounds for marriage. This created tension between Galilee with Herod Antipas and the Nabateans with uh, Aretas the fourth. And it became a political hot potato because there were a lot of Nabateans who lived in Antipas's territory of Perea. And the last thing you need is people in your territory who are really loyal to your enemy. Eventually, it led to war, and the Nabateans whooped Herod's butt. Am I allowed to say that on YouTube? He would have lost his kingdom if the Romans hadn't intervened. Herod Antipas's bad marriage arrangement to Herodias was politically sensitive. So along comes the prophet John. Sometimes we're addressing moral issues, but those moral issues appear to have political implications. I used to tell this story in my New Testament class when I was teaching back in the 90s, and people said, they actually did this. They actually accused me of talking about this because I was against Bill Clinton. And more recently, I've talked about this, and people said, it's because you're against Donald Trump. Look, I'm not trying to be politically partisan. That's my point. Moral issues, we can talk about moral issues, and hopefully we're not, well, we may not mean them in politically partisan ways, but they are often heard in politically partisan ways. Antipas, the last thing he needed with his problem with the Nabateans was to have John going around talking about his bad marriage arrangement. So he has John arrested, places him in the dungeon in Machaerus, his Prian fortress, and then has to protect him from Herodias. Although she could have had him killed in the prison just as easily as out in public. But she needs to do it in a way that Herod will have to take the responsibility for. So John gets executed. Now, Mark sometimes calls Herod Antipas a king. I say Herod Antipas. Um, probably most of Mark's audience would already have heard of Herod the Great, even if they were Gentiles, even though Mark is writing, later than these events. Herod and the Herodian family were known in Rome, and in fact, some of the Herods grew up in Rome. Herod Agrippa I, Herod Agrippa II, they grew up in Rome anyway, let me not digress too much. So Antipas, Mark calls him Herod. It's just easier, but if it has any associations in people's minds, well, they may think of the wrong Herod, but hey, these guys were scoundrels. Same with Herod Agrippa I, who's called Herod in Acts chapter 12, but then Herod Agrippa II, who behaves himself much more nicely towards Paul, he gets called Agrippa in Acts 23 through 26. But anyway, Antipas was not technically a king. He was only a tetrarch. Mark may be making fun of him. Mark almost certainly knows what happened later. The people who originally told the story knew what happened later, or found out pretty quickly. And maybe some of his audience also knows about this. Herodias had a brother, Herod Agrippa the First. And Herod Agrippa the First was party buddies with Gaius Caligula in Rome. Well, Caligula later became emperor and took care of his old friend, who actually went to prison temporarily because he was already wishing that Agrippa was wishing that Gaius Caligula would be emperor. And Tiberius, the emperor, wasn't dead yet. So Agrippa got himself in a little trouble there. But when Agrippa died, um, obviously he was released. Caligula took care of him, and later on, he's still being taken care of under the next emperor, Claudius. Agrippa I became king over Judea. He reigned there from the years 41 to 44. Now, Antipas had been only tetrarch since 4 BC. So for decades, let's see, 40, yeah, I mean, close to half a century, Antipas had been only a tetrarch, and Herodias was upset. My brother's a king. Why aren't you a king? Well, nobody could be king unless the emperor says so, Antipas pleaded. Now, Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us that Herodias kept pestering him. I know this sounds like, well, she does kind of sound like Jezebel, working around reluctant Ahab in the Old Testament, scholars often point out. This is just to say, Mark can't depend on Josephus. Mark is written before Josephus. Josephus probably had no idea who Mark was or what Mark's gospel was. So they're not depending on each other, but they present a similar portrait of this lady. And of course, John the Baptist is a new Elijah, but he doesn't get caught up to heaven in a chariot of fire. So nobody can be king unless the emperor says so, Antipas pleaded. But Josephus says that Herodias kept pestering him till finally Antipas petitioned the emperor to become king. Could I please, Mr. Emperor, become a king like my brother-in-law? To which the emperor responded, no one can be king unless I say he can be king. And I'm sorry about the pictures here. I just used whatever I got for free off of back then Microsoft PowerPoint Image Bank. And so I didn't have a good picture of the emperor getting mad at him. So I just put some stuff together. But anyway, he was so mad about the request that he banished Antipas to Gaul. Josephus reports that twice and banishes him to somewhere else the other time. But anyway, Antipas to Gaul. And he says to Herodias, well, your brother is my friend. I'm not going to make you go into exile. But she's like, hey, you can't exile my husband. That's not right. And she protests, and he says, okay, well, you can go into exile too. So Herod Antipas and Herodias spent their last days as exiles in Gaul. Herod didn't give up half his kingdom. He gave up his entire tetrarchy. Not to rub it in, but they should have probably listened to John, right? Adultery never pays. Well, this whole section, Mark chapter 6, verses 14 through 29, about Herod Antipas and John the Baptist, is framed by Jesus sending out the disciples in 6, 7 to 13, and now the disciples coming back in verse 30. So, yeah, God does all sorts of miracles through them, but they're not supposed to get a triumphalistic attitude about it. Because the Gospel of Mark, talks about faith for miracles. It also talks about faith to face suffering. And the disciples aren't getting that picture yet. So they come back and report all that they had done and taught. So exorcism and healing, and also preaching repentance. We know this from 6, 7, and 12 and 13. And they sound pretty excited, just like the 70 who come back in Luke chapter 70 or 72, come back in Luke chapter 10. Lord, in your name, even the demons submit to us. And Jesus says, that's great, but even greater than that is your names are written down in heaven. Their return from their mission frames the much larger, more ominous narrative of the forerunner's execution. If these are to be Jesus' successors, they need to get wise to the pattern. We need to avoid triumphalism. When God uses us, well, the mission includes both miracles and martyrdom, signs and suffering. And this is for those who carry on Jesus' mission as a whole, not that everyone does every one of these things. So they're called apostles in chapter 6, verse 30. This is the only use in Mark, unless 3:14 belongs to the original text. That's debated. Well, not that 3:14 is, but that the wording apostles is there in the original text there. And it's referring to the 12, which fits the verb apostellein in chapter 6 and verse 7 when Jesus sends them out. It's also used, Matthew uses it for the 12. It's Matthew's only use. Luke normally reserves it for the 12, except in Acts 14, where he applies it to Paul and Barnabas. Paul uses the term much more broadly. So Romans 1, Romans 16, Romans 15, 5-7, Jesus appears to the 12 and to somebody else, then to all the apostles. Galatians 1:19, 1 Thessalonians 2:7, probably 1 Corinthians 12:28. In other words, and it's also used for Silas and Timothy. Oh, no, that's okay, First Thessalonians. So Paul uses the term much more broadly, but he's aware of the narrower use, which some probably were using to challenge Paul's apostleship, but he has it in a much broader way. So when people say, "Are apostles still for today?" Well, in the sense of the 12 aren't for today. I mean, they're dead. They ceased, right? So, I mean, on this earth. But in the more general sense in which Paul uses it, apostolic mission goes on in terms of groundbreaking for the kingdom, laying new foundations for the kingdom. That's still for today, because there are places where ground still needs to be broken. But again, that's a digression. So, contrasting two kings' banquets. Herod's grisly banquet for elites serves up John's head. Jesus' banquet in the wilderness feeds the hungry, and in a sense previews the banquet, the Passover banquet in chapter 14, where Jesus is going to talk about giving his own body and blood, not just his head, but his body and his blood, and ultimately prefiguring the messianic banquet to come in Mark 14:25. But they need rest for restoration. Jesus is aware of the need for boundaries in our lives. So he wants them to go to a deserted place, an eremos topos, away from the crowds. And this language has occurred earlier in Mark, where Jesus goes aside into a deserted place to pray, but also where he's kind of kept out in the deserted place because his popularity is so great he can't even go into town. And they face this now. His popularity is so great, so many people are coming, they don't even have opportunity to eat. And I know sometimes when I've been busy, I miss a meal, but my stomach quickly reminds me that I'm missing a meal. And if it's possible, I try to take care of that. Sometimes it's not possible, though. Sometimes in the midst of our ministry. Anyway, self-care is important. We need to take care of ourselves, and whenever we can. But sometimes there are crises, and we have to do what we have to do. So in Mark 3:20, also, the crowd came together, so the disciples didn't even have opportunity to eat. So the needs are unending. The work never is done. So you don't wait until you've met everybody else's needs before you try to take care of yourself, because the needs are never going to run out. But Jesus wants to take the disciples aside so they're able to get refreshed or recharged. The crowds, however, find them. And Jesus is not going to diss them after they've come all this way. So he takes care of them. And a good host in antiquity needed to feed them. You can see why Martha's so worried, oh boy, I got to feed Jesus and his disciples. And who else did he invite? But anyway, that's Luke 10:38-42. And I'm just joking. So anyway, Jesus feeds he's going to feed them. That's an obligation of hosts that you see elsewhere in the Gospels. And here are some jokes about it. But anyway, the feeding of the 5,000 may have been near Bethsaida, but there are debates on where Bethsaida exactly was. In fact, when a friend and I were trying to go find Bethsaida, we ended up finding just a place between the two major reported sites for Bethsaida. So we got some nice pictures of the marsh there. But anyway, they got out on foot ahead of him, the crowds did. Now, how does that make sense? When Jesus and his disciples are in a boat, and we know from the recovered Galilee boat archaeologists discovered from about this period, it could hold Jesus and all of his disciples at the same time. Well, not all of his disciples, all of the 12, at least at the same time, and Jesus and maybe a couple other people. But they're in a boat. How can the crowd get there ahead of them? And well, the crowd recognized them as they were setting out in the boat, and someone maybe at the harbor may have heard where they were headed. If they're up in a hill, they could actually see maybe the progress of the boat, but then they'd still have to get to the crowd and tell them. So it's more likely that people heard where they were going. Boat travel was usually faster unless you had contrary winds, but this is a retreat for the purpose of resting. So the boat is probably moving at a leisurely pace, kind of resting on their way. Well, it's good they rested a little bit on their way. Because when the crowd gathers, Jesus has compassion. And you see that again before the next time he's going to feed a crowd. In chapter 8 and verse 2, I have compassion for the crowd because they've been with me now for 3 days and they have nothing to eat. You can compare also Mark 9:22, where we see someone asking for Jesus to show compassion. And possibly you have it in Mark 1:41, although there's a big debate about the exact Greek word that's used there. So we won't get into that right now. But Jesus demonstrates compassion for these unshepherded sheep by teaching them. He's going to feed them, but part of his compassion is expressed in teaching them. We dare not underplay the importance of teaching. And that's very important for Jesus' mission. Mark talks about it a lot. He doesn't give us as many of Jesus' teachings as, say, Matthew does, but he certainly reports Jesus' teaching quite often. Now, the shepherd image was already widely used for leaders. It had been used that way in the ancient Near East. It was used that way all the time in Homer. The shepherd of the people, Agamemnon or others. And often it was used as an image of caring and compassion, both in the Old Testament and in Greek sources. And of course, the Old Testament laments when people are wandering like sheep without a shepherd. So Numbers 27, verse 17, talks about so that the people of the Lord may not be like sheep without a shepherd. So Moses appoints Joshua as his successor, so they'll still have a leader. And then when King Ahab dies, the people are scattered like sheep without a shepherd. And in the book of Judith, later on, Judith lying to Holofernes, you will drive them like sheep that have no shepherd. Common language. Here are sheep and shepherds. I don't think you can hear this, but I guess it doesn't matter because I can tell you he's pointing to sheep. And those are real authentic sheep. They're not plastic or anything. This is from Nazareth Village. And more photos from Nazareth Village and more photos from Todd Boland. Yeah, I probably look a little bit sheepish here. God's people as sheep scattered, because the human shepherds didn't care for them. In Ezekiel or in Zechariah, it speaks of God's people being sheep scattered. Or the leaders of God's people led them astray or led others astray. So the Lord himself becomes their shepherd in Ezekiel 34 and raises up a Davidic shepherd also in Ezekiel 34 and Ezekiel 37. All that to say, this is really evocative of Old Testament promises. Jesus acting like a shepherd here, which may also fit some of the Zechariah allusion later that you have in Mark chapter 14. So the disciples are like, send them away to buy food. Well, Mark says that it's late. It's not yet evening in the way Mark narrates this. That's coming in verse 47. So, but Jesus is going to make it efficient so they can organize their distribution and do it fairly quickly. But it's late enough, people need to get food because they don't have enough food there by themselves. But while this may sound like good thinking, it's actually not very good thinking because the average village had maybe 200 to 300 residents. So how would a deserted place find food for more than 5,000 people? I mean, they can go around to the nearby villages, but there's not going to be enough. And Jesus doesn't want people fainting on the way. Some people are stronger than others, but some people constitutionally, I mean, they have diabetes and things like that. And if they don't get their caloric intake, they may not be able to walk the whole way back home. Jesus acts as host and feeds them and tells the disciples to do that. And the disciples are like, that would cost like a year's wages. I don't think we have that much on hand. Well, this again evokes an earlier story. The disciples don't get it, but Jesus certainly would understand. In 2 Kings chapter 4, somebody donates food for the sons of the prophets who are gathered. And Elisha says, give it to the people and let them eat. But his servant, I don't think it's Gehazi yet, although it is in chapter 5. Anyway, his servant says, or his attendant, his apprentice, so to speak, says, how can I set this before 100 people? It's not enough. Well, that's not 5,000, but still it's not enough. And so he says, give it to them and let them eat. And then he says, then he prophesies, the Lord says, there's going to be enough and there'll be some left over. And sure enough, it happens. And John chapter 6, recounting the same event as Mark here, makes the evocation even clearer by mentioning that these are barley loaves, just like they were in 2 Kings chapter 4. So this is Todd Boland has this picture for like what some of the surrounding villages may have looked like. And this is like markets where you could buy something, bread to eat and so on. And in terms of the money, these are pictures of denarii. So this is how many loaves do you have? Keep good records for your miracles. If a miracle takes place, I mean, some things you may feel like it's a miracle, but it may not be persuasive to unbelievers. But the ones that could be persuasive if they knew about it, if you have access to records like your medical documentation, please keep that. Send it to Global Medical Research Institute or somebody who can. This was one of my frustrations when working on the miracles books. Way more testimonies, even from people who were fully reliable, well, whom I had full reason to believe were reliable, and multiple independent testimony. So in historiography, that's convincing. But for a lot of people, other people, I mean, historians, journalists, sociologists, anthropologists, um, in courts of law, I mean, we have to make use of testimony. But for some things, it's possible to actually get medical documentation, which is something that some people, that's the only thing they'll accept. So, we got some, but there's a whole lot more available if people would really keep good records, like was done on this occasion, apparently. They knew how many people were there, they knew how many loaves they had, how many fish they had, and so they could keep track. Uh, and it may be good even for yourself later to remind yourself of God's power. No, it's not, I'm not remembering this wrong. Look. So 5 loaves, 2 fish. The fish were probably salted and dried. Fish don't last too long after the catch. So, uh, yeah, and the disciples, if they had just arrived and were resting, they probably hadn't just gone fishing. So 5 loaves, 2 fish. Bread was a basic staple throughout the Mediterranean world, usually from wheat, but also could be from barley. And here, John tells us it's from barley. Fish, obviously, were a basic staple all around the Lake of Galilee. And also they could be dried, salted, and exported to the rest of Judea and Galilee, and actually even other places in the Mediterranean world, and used for fish sauce and uh, you know. And anyway, they could be used for all sorts of things in antiquity, but that's for better for background for 116 through 20, I guess. Or when we talk about Mary Magdalene in 1540, and we talk about Magdala, which was probably the center of the fish packing, fish processing uh, place in Galilee, at least according to the most recent reports. Um, Sometimes archaeological evidence gets disputed and then somebody else comes out with a different interpretation. But as of 2024, anyway, the majority view of what was going on, Terache being Magdala. So this might represent their own provisions. Recently, they hadn't had opportunity to eat, and they don't have a whole lot right now. Not really even enough for each of them to have one of these loaves, and these loaves weren't really that big. So, uh, and yeah, here are some more pictures from Taudbolen. This one's from Tabga, where also there's a tradition of feeding miracle. Here's the plain of Bethsaida, which is mentioned by Mark, I think 6:45, if I remember. And so he commanded them all to sit down. This is not in groups of 100 or 50s or whatever here, but you can see how people could sit. Often people would recline to eat, at least at banquets, following the what had been the Greek custom. And here's a traditional location of the multiplication of the 5 loaves. Again, from Todd Boland. Thank you, Todd, again for these. So Jesus makes sure that the distribution is organized. That's the best way to ensure equitable distribution. We don't know when the precise charity system described in the Mishnah by later rabbis originated, probably sometime in the 2nd century. But in any case, Rome's grain dole also, I mean, there were census records to keep track of how the grain was distributed. And people would, in the Mediterranean world, they would really want to honor whoever was their benefactor, or in the Roman world, patron, especially the emperor. Well, here a true king is going to give a banquet. He has them recline in groups. The Greek term here is symposion, repeated a couple times. Symposia were often accompanied with teaching and or discussion, well, at least the highbrow symposia were that. And Jesus has been teaching. They recline on green grass. That fits the Passover season, which is independently confirmed by John mentioning that it was around Passover time, and also mentioning there was much grass. Probably a better cushion than sitting on sharper straw or something. There was only a certain time when this would be flourishing as green grass. So he has him sit down by hundreds and fifties. Um, so here's a picture of, I think this was probably my own. Todd Bullen specializes in more excellent pictures. But anyway, actually, maybe this is his. I don't know. Anyway, summer grass withers, the flower fades. But having them sit by hundreds and fifties, commentators often say that this is like Old Testament military ranks, or like more generally arranging the people of God. And that fits the evocation of a new Moses who provides something like new manna for the people. So this is, you can decide for yourself. Qumran also has this for the people of God. But one thing I think is pretty clear, whether we have an evocation of that directly or not, and that is that Jesus makes the distribution organized so that everybody gets enough and nobody gets left out while some people get, too much. I mean, too much, if the thing keeps multiplying, I guess people are going to, well, it's, they get to eat all that they want, and there's going to be some left over. But this way, you don't have like people distributing over here and not distributing to these people over here. Jesus looks up to heaven. That's a common posture of prayer. It's not closing your eyes to concentrate the mind. Not That's not wrong, but it's often looking to the heavens. To you I lift up my eyes, O you who are enthroned in the heavens, Psalm 123. Or in Luke, the tax collector who wouldn't even look up to heaven. Or in John chapter 17, Jesus lifts up his eyes to heaven. He gives a blessing over the food. Now, the prayer, the most basic rudimentary form of the prayer that's used today probably was already in use in the first century. It certainly was in the second century, at least among many people. But probably it already was in use fairly widely in the first century. And the reason I think that is because before the Mishnah, we have the Didache, and the Didache seems to echo some of this language. First Timothy 4 may actually echo some of it as well. But in any case, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Amen. Maybe not that tune. I don't know if that went that far back. And I'm sure that cantors and anybody else can sing it, keep the tune way better than I. But anyway, blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has brought forth bread from the earth. Now, often there could be a blessing before and after the meal, although the latter one may be a later custom. It's hard to know. Jesus blesses food again in Mark chapter 8, but he does it also in Mark chapter 14. That is, this may be a preview again of the ultimate meal that Jesus is going to have with his disciples. Then again, people just about always gave thanks for their food before eating it. So the question is not whether Jesus gave thanks for food before meals, but why Mark keeps telling us that he did, since it was already a common practice. This word eulogeo might be interchangeable with eucharisteo, which is also used in the other passages. So not so much like I bless you, food, but more like I bless the food. I give God thanks for this food. So usually when I give thanks for the food before I eat it, but I don't. Maybe I should ask God to bless the food. Maybe it would make it easier on my digestion. Although my digestion has been much better recently. But anyway, it's distributed via the disciples. He delegates what he can, and that's a good biblical principle. Exodus 18, and of course Moses to the 72 elders, if you count Eldad and Medad out in the camp, 72 elders in Numbers chapter 11, Moses delegating to Joshua. You see this with the 12 delegating it to the 7 in Acts chapter 6. Jesus delegates what he can. It multiplies his effectiveness. If he has to hand it out to each of the 5,000 by himself, that's going to take a long time. Or even to groups of 100, that's going to take a long time. But if he divides it among the 12, it's going to go a lot faster. Also, this helps prepare the disciples for their work. I mean, they may not, well, I don't know, maybe it's also multiplying not just when he breaks it, but when they break it, but because of him. But whatever the case may be, how, whatever it looks like, I kind of envision it like uh, when you have, sometimes we have bread, it's not fully cooked, and you're pulling it open and it's still going. Um, well, I'm not saying that this wasn't fully cooked. It's unleavened bread cakes, but it should still, well, is it unleavened bread cakes? Actually, it might be leavened anyway. But either way, when Jesus breaks it, uh, the way I imagine it is kind of like that. But that's just my imagination. I think most of the movies I've seen so far, they uh, they just show the basket full of. It's easier that way. But however one's to envision it, it multiplies his effectiveness. It also prepares the disciples for their mission of carrying on his mission, because they're right up front. They get to witness the miracle firsthand, which is going to be relevant for why Jesus rebukes him in chapter 8 for not realizing what he can do. And I guess the more they participate, the more it's going to prepare them, just like he sent them out to preach and heal in his name, and that spread his name. At the same time, it's going to do it without revealing too much to the crowds. They're not going to necessarily see how it's happening. Though, despite precautions for the secret, the crowds, at least in John 6, realize that something's up and they want to make him a king in 6:15. So here's um, a slab showing the multiplication of the loaves and the fishes as envisioned in early centuries. They all ate, and there were more leftovers than the food that they started with. That's a lot of leftovers. They're not going to need a miracle for the next meal. So this miracle as a whole, whatever you make of details here and there, evokes the kind of things that Moses did. In fact, that's a big deal also in John chapter 6, where John elaborates more on the nature of what happened. God gave manna from heaven in the time of Moses. Moses says, well, there's going to be another prophet like me. And Jesus comes and feeds a multitude in the wilderness. And also Elijah, food multiplication miracle for the widow of Zarephath. We already mentioned the one with Elisha, which is actually the closest here, except it's on a larger scale, smaller than Moses, but larger than Elisha. Smaller than Moses because there were fewer people. But picking up the leftovers, John 6:12, when they were satisfied, he told his disciples, gather up the fragments that are left over so that nothing may be lost. God does miracles to meet needs, not just for entertainment. They're not going to need a miracle for their next meal. Similar principle in Joshua 5:12. The manna ceased on the day that they ate the produce of the land, and the Israelites no longer had manna. They ate the crops of the land of Canaan that year. The only manna was in the ark, and that wasn't even there later when they checked a few centuries later. You probably wouldn't expect it to still be there, but anyway. But with God, there's no limit. In other words, when it's needed, God does miracles, but not just entertain us. He provides for us through natural means most of the time. So, yeah, we pray for our daily bread, but we also go out and earn our living if we can. So why 12 or save for it or whatever? Why 12 baskets? Well, there were 12 apostles, Each has a basket. That's about all they can carry. If there were 24 baskets, who's going to carry them all? So you've got 5,000 men, and Matthew is explicit that that number doesn't include women and children, but you already know that from the word aner, or here the plural andres. Why does he give the number? Well, the organization allows the documentation of the miracle, showing the magnitude of the miracle. This is 50 times the number fed by Elisha. And here's a fiber basket. This is actually from ancient Egypt, so this is way earlier, but the nature of the baskets didn't change that much over the centuries. Here's from a fish market in Alexandria more recently, and here's another ancient Egyptian, I think it's Egyptian basket. And here you have some pictures, again from Todd Bolin, of women on the way to the market with baskets on their heads. Uh, these ones in black and white are usually way, well, you already know they're way older. But anyway, um, do nature miracles like multiplication miracles still occur? Certainly, we have reports of them today from people who claim to be eyewitnesses. So, no reason to say that this story had to be made up later. In the Indonesian revival, I think this shouldn't say the 1970s. I think 1965 is when the West Timor revival began. But there were massive reports of miracles, and a previously doubtful Western researcher, Kurt Koch, saw a number of blind eyes opened and saw water turn to wine. Now, when I say previously skeptical, he didn't believe that miracles had ceased. He definitely was not charismatic. He thought the charismatics were nuts, which is not my view. But he, well, with some of them it is. But anyway, not with, yeah, I am one. So, and again, some people think I'm nuts, but okay. But what he saw a number of blind eyes opened and saw water turn to wine. He thought, okay, maybe I'll see, somebody's limp go away after a day or two or something. But he was shocked by what he saw. And of course, before he reported it, he went ahead and got a whole lot of affidavits from the other witnesses because he said, I'm going back to the Western world. Nobody's going to believe this when I go back. And sure enough, he did get criticized considerably by one person, particularly who visited Indonesia, said it didn't happen. Koch pointed out that the person went to a different part of Indonesia. Indonesia's got a bunch of different islands, and I don't know, last I looked at, I think it had like 150 million people. It's probably 200 million or so by now. Somewhere vast number of people. And he also pointed out that the person went after the revival had waned. Koch went there in the midst of what was happening. Brandon Walker, PhD in New Testament from University of Nottingham, witnessed food multiplied in Mozambique, and so did other people that I've talked with. On multiple occasions, Roland and Heidi Baker talked about it. Heidi has a PhD in theology. Roland has a Doctor of Ministry degree. I talk with Roland, or email and sometimes talk with Roland fairly often. They witnessed food multiplied in Mozambique, but so have others who've gone there. I know some of you who are watching on YouTube, whether my students or not, don't believe me, but I already told you some people think I'm nuts, okay? But these are people I trust in terms of, they say what they believe they've seen. And Roland and I talk theology different times. And anyway, multiplied food. So if you don't like charismatics and you don't like Kurt Koch, well, here's an Anglican testimony of multiplied food. When Grant Lamarckand was Anglican bishop for the Horn of Africa, there were about 100 refugees crowded under the church property. And you've got to be a good host. That's good African culture as well. So the church had some peanut butter crackers, but they were only enough at that point to feed maybe 12 people. All they could do, they prayed over it and handed it out. And everybody ate, this 100 people, everybody ate as much as they wanted, took second helpings. So Jesus makes the disciples cross the lake toward Bethsaida. Yeah, that's where it is in 645. And the reason that some people think the feeding was near Bethsaida was because of a different gospel. So historically, the reason may be because of the situation in John 6:15. They're trying to make him king. Okay, Jesus is going up to the mountain, but he's also going to send the disciples away. With Mark's secret motif, it doesn't require so much explanation to simply omit the factors, that people think Jesus is king. Yeah, Jesus needs to diffuse that really quick. But Jesus knows that they're going to face wind. Maybe he has a purpose in their testing, 648. Bethsaida is on the northern shore, but where they end up is on the west, 653. Gennesaret, the plain there. So why do they end up somewhere else? Adverse wind, that's a literary explanation. Condensed material, that's a source critical explanation. Cross Bethsaidon could mean in the direction of Bethsaida, kind of generically. That's a grammatical explanation. In Luke 9:10, the feeding itself is apparently near Bethsaida. I'm raising a question, the precise answer to which I don't have. I can just give some of the different explanations that have been given. But anyway, Jesus dismisses the crowd, verse 45. And in other words, he presumably says something to him. He's polite. Maybe doesn't give a farewell speech, as was common when you were leaving, but at least he says farewell to them. Et-tel is a possible location of Bethsaida. There's been increasing support for that. Wait a minute, no, I'm mixing that up. El-Araj, there's increasing support for that. Et-tel is has been the traditional site that archaeologists, very good archaeologists, for a long time thought was the major site, but El-Araj actually seems to have better claim. At the moment I'm saying this, excavations haven't probably gone far enough to make that decisive yet, but I kind of lean toward El-Araj myself as the possible site of Bethsaida. Here is where I was lost, but it's somewhere near Bethsaida, and really probably between the two sites. So I have good footage from a lot of sites, but I don't have good footage from Et-tel and not from where I really even more would have wanted to go at this point, El-Araj. So here is the plain of Bethsaida and Sea of Galilee, plain of Bethsaida again. This is on the shoreline of the Sea of Galilee at Tabga being really close to Capernaum. And here's again the shore of the Sea of Galilee. I probably should have thrown in one of my pictures on the Lake of Galilee too. But anyway, Jesus goes to a mountain to pray. Mountains appear as good places to pray and to worship or to receive revelation elsewhere in Scripture. Mount Sinai or Mount Zion, or elsewhere in the gospel tradition, various mountains usually not named. You have mountains with such functions in Mark, again in Mark 3:13 and 9:2, not named by Mark, although people have proposed various ideas that we could talk about when we get to chapter 9 about what the site of the transfiguration was. Jesus prays at mountains in 1:35. Well, actually, it just is a deserted place. Okay, so I did the PowerPoint before, and I actually forgot what some of the things are in the PowerPoint, but please don't tell anybody. Please don't tell my viewers. Please don't tell your fellow students who are watching this video that I flubbed up on that. Okay, so this is just about Jesus praying, other scenes where he's praying, Mark 1:35 and 14:35. It's interesting, Jesus in 9:29 tells his disciples the reason they couldn't cast out this one demon, they need to be more in prayer. There's different interpretations of what that means, but it is interesting that in Mark's gospel, we never actually see the disciples praying, but the one we do see praying is Jesus himself. Well, one advantage of the mountain is that, like it back in 135, it's a deserted place. So the timing, it's now evening, Upsia, 6:47. That can mean any time later than another, but usually sometime between afternoon and darkness. The hour was already late before the massive feeding. It may just mean too late to return home and find food. So the fourth watch of the night, when Jesus comes to them, and they haven't gotten very far because of the adverse wind, maybe blown off course, but at least they haven't gotten very far. So the fourth watch of the night is between 3 or 4 and 6 a.m. That's a really adverse wind because the Lake of Galilee is not very big. I mean, here in the US, we have the Great Lakes. You could fit a whole bunch of lakes of Galilee that locally was called a Thalasat, a sea. You could fit a whole bunch of those in any of our Great Lakes. But anyway, um, how could they see him walking toward them? I mean, granted, they didn't see him very well. They thought he was a ghost. But how could they see him? Well, he's coming from the east toward dawn. There's at least some light behind him. And it's a windstorm on the lake rather than necessarily the sky being obscured. But yeah, they didn't see him very well. So here's an artist's depiction of this. And here's a dramatization of somebody walking. I don't know what he's actually standing on, but anyway, here you see it again. But you can see he's standing on something. He's not walking. Now there he looks like he's walking, but anyway, maybe somebody actually did walk on water just for the video, but I don't think so. So they did post a sign near the lake, or right beside the Lake of Galilee, just because maybe somebody would try to duplicate Jesus' miracle, I guess. Anyway, no walking on water. So it comes to them walking on the sea. What would that look like? Well, if they were riding on the waves, maybe it'd be something like a surfer, just without a surfboard, and yeah, riding on the waves. But maybe the water's flattened around him, like water congealing. So walking versus riding. Well, I've interviewed a couple people today who claim to have walked on water. Again, I know some of you think I'm crazy for even taking people's word for it, but people think I'm crazy when I tell you experiences I've had that, watching certain things happen, like storms stilled at time of prayer and so on. So if you don't like it, just fast forward a minute. But anyway, interviews today, people have said, well, it just felt to them shallow. It just came to their ankles or their knees. So they didn't realize they were walking on water when they did it. They only found out afterwards because other people couldn't replicate it because it was so deep and raging. Some ancient stories. So the way ancient audiences may have imagined the story taking place as they heard Mark tell it or heard Mark being read. People were supposedly walking on the surface in a way like one skipping a stone across the surface. But those were all about characters of the mythical past. They never come from eyewitness reports from within living memory, whereas Mark is written within a generation of the events he's recounting. So Jesus intended to pass them by. Now, why is he coming to them in their distress, intending to pass them by? Well, I don't know if he's intending to pass them by permanently, but anyway, it makes a good object lesson. But he responds to the misunderstanding and joins them. But why mention the intent to pass them by? And we can't reconstruct the meaning from other uses of perichoomai in Mark because there aren't very many of them, and none of them are applied in a way similar to this. But like the Transfiguration, this becomes a revelation for those who could understand it, which at that point didn't include any of the disciples. But this is a revelation of his secret identity. And it evokes familiar biblical accounts, the Greek translation of which uses parerchomai as here, of divine revelations to Moses and Elijah on mountains. So in Exodus 33, God says to Moses, I won't let you see all my glory, but I'll let you part of it, and I will pass before you as I reveal my glory. Exodus 34:6, the Lord passed before him and revealed his character to Moses. 1 Kings 19:11, he said, go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Now, this was sometimes conjoined with walking on waves. So Job, speaking about the Lord, Job 9:8 says that the Lord stretched out the heavens and he alone trampled the waves of the sea. And in the Greek translation, parapaton, walking as though epithalases on the sea, walking on the ground upon the sea. And a few verses later, look, he passes by using a form of parerchomai. He passes by me, I don't see him. He moves on, but I don't perceive him. So in Mark, that should say 6:48. Please don't tell anybody I made that mistake. When you watch this video again, please pretend I didn't make this mistake. But anyway, walking on the sea and intending to pass them by. Again with parapaton epites thalases, and then the form of parerchomai, parelthane. They supposed him to be a ghost. Pagans thought that those who died at sea, or anybody unburied, they thought they couldn't enter the netherworld, the underworld. And I believe it's in Achilles Tatius. It's a novel, but it seems to presuppose that this was the understanding that when those who died at sea, because they were unburied, they couldn't enter the netherworld, they would hover over the place of their death. And these were considered very dangerous kinds of ghosts. I mean, they were mad sometimes. So just like Herod Antipas had a virtual reincarnation idea back in 6:14 through 16, which should not fit good Pharisaic or good Danielic or good Jesus's, if you look at Mark chapter 12, eschatology. Herod Antipas, people would say, that's superstitious. Look, and how could Jesus be John coming back as a grown-up? If you're going to be reincarnated, you come back as a baby, right? But anyway, didn't make any sense at all. And people would say, how superstitious Herod Antipas is. But Mark pulls a gotcha, because after we've been laughing at Herod Antipas and identifying with the disciples, the same chapter later on, the disciples have afterlife beliefs that are also superstitious. Now, again, in their situation, maybe we would react similarly. This isn't like the ideal situation to be thinking through your eschatological beliefs. And actually, pretty much everybody knows that I don't think, I don't hold the most popular view of the rapture, which is everybody get raptured before Great Tribulation. Actually, I think there's plenty of Great Tribulation going on elsewhere in the world, but that's not what people mean by that anyway. But I certainly wouldn't complain if I'm wrong. But anyway, Mark's afterlife beliefs, he believes in a bodily resurrection in the future. He believes in the wicked being cast into a burning place, Gehinnom, in chapter 9. And he believes that the spirits of the righteous are with God until the time of the resurrection. But that's not the way the disciples are acting. Oh, it's a ghost. I mean, it could be some other kind of spirit, but they seem to be acting like it's a ghost. And so they cried out, anakradzo, Mark's other use of this is for an unclean spirit crying out in 123. But it just means, these are people in desperate situations. There are other words used for crying out in Mark's gospel that, well, Jesus himself cries out. But anyway, not with that particular verb. But anyway, Jesus calls them not to fear, chapter 6 and 50, verse 50. That's common for assurances in antiquity, um, especially during angelic appearances and divine appearances. And you can always pause the video if you want to write down the references. It's me, Jesus says. Ego and me, absolute non-predicative use. It can mean simply, it's me. Even the Gospel of John uses it that way once. When people say, are you the guy who used to be blind? Or used to beg because he was blind? Yeah, I am. I'm he. But in the context of the allusion to God treading on the waves and passing by, this is a lot more like the usual usage in John's gospel for this event, but also for a lot of other times. In that context, this is like, yeah, ego and me, I am. I am who I am. Now in Exodus 3:14, that's ego and me, own. But in the Greek translation of Isaiah, sometimes it's just ego and me. I am the Lord. I am he. In Greek translation, ego and me. And sometimes it's doubled ego and me. The wind ceased, and the disciples were astonished. The wind ceased also in 4:35 to 41 when Jesus commanded it to cease. But this time, the wind respects Jesus so much it doesn't even wait for a command. The disciples were astonished. You see that often in response to Jesus' actions. It's also used sometimes for going nuts. But the disciples were astonished. Now, they'd seen him still a storm before. They were astonished then. This goes beyond that. But they should have understood, because of the multiplying of the loaves, that Jesus could act even beyond the constraints of visible creation. You see that in 652. And 652 says they didn't understand why, because their hearts were hardened. Like the Pharisees who were plotting against Jesus back in, well, I guess they plotted against him in the next verse. They were looking out for him earlier in chapter 3, kind of spying on him maybe. But in 3:5, their hearts were hardened, where they were more concerned with Jesus following their rule than they were about the man getting his hand back for full use. And there they grieved to Jesus. And it's also used to the Pharisees in chapter 10 and verse 5. Again, not going into all the stuff I've said before, previous lessons about the Pharisees. Not all Pharisees were the same. Most of Jesus' opponents were probably Shamites rather than Hillelites and so forth. But anyway, they come off sometimes with hard hearts here because they should have known better. They usually knew scripture pretty well. And also in chapter 4, where it's used basically for all the outsiders. Well, here it's used for the disciples. And Jesus is finally going to call them on it in chapter 8, verse 17, again using porao, referring to the miracle of the loaves. Now, one of the accounts of walking on water that I got was from Maltari. I'd read years ago in his couple of his books that recount a number of miracles that took place in Indonesia. And actually, this is not just Maltari who talked about it. There are many reports from Indonesia that recounted this. Many, many witnesses reported in different places, and not just in 1965, also during a revival in the early 20th century in a more Lutheran part of Maltari's part was Reformed, which I think is one reason why Koch liked it because he was Reformed and he trusted fellow Reformed Christians more than he would trust others. But it's also reported in a Lutheran revival earlier. Why are so many of the water walking reports from Indonesia? My guess is Indonesia has lots of water and lots of, you know, it's, I mean, not just islands separated. I don't have any reports of somebody walking from one island to another, but crossing rivers and so on. Um, and Mel's report, the way he reported it in the book, he didn't report it in the first person. He reported it, some of his relatives were in the group and he just reported it about them. But when I interviewed him, he told me, yeah, I actually was there, but I didn't want all the stories to be about myself. I've actually done that in some of my earlier books, stories that where I was there, I put in the third person for various reasons, but in one of them, three crucial questions about the Holy Spirit. I did it often because I thought I was already talking about myself too much. But those are the stories I knew and could use as illustrations with having to do extra research. Anyway, so he told me about this and said we didn't actually know we were walking on water when we did it. And Christine Calvin also told me. So one Reformed and one Nazarene, and uh, lets you know it happens with more than one. But um, there were, yeah, anyway, I'll just move on because those of you who don't believe it won't believe it. And those of you who do believe it will believe it. So I'm just moving on. Gennesaret, verse 53. Um, the lake, often called the Lake of Gennesaret, Hebrew Kinneret. Um, this is from Joel Marcus's commentary on Mark, which is one of my very favorites. 3.5 mile long plain on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee between Tiberias and Capernaum. I didn't think I could put it better than he, so I just quoted him. It's on the northwest shore, about 3 miles or nearly 5 kilometers from Capernaum, and that's their destination actually in John 6. So it makes sense of that part. The administrative center for the area was Magdala, which we well we usually identify with Terache, the Greek name. Administrative center subsequently became nearby Tiberias. Gordon France says that the harbor of the Gennesaret region was built slightly to the east of Tel Kinneret, the city that gives its name to the lake. It has two breakwaters that are perpendicular to the shore and one breakwater parallel to the shore, about 77 yards or 70 meters long. Now, having said that, most of the harbors that have been found are not from the first century, but they very likely kept building on the same place. So, when you build on the same place, you're not going to have the first century version, you're going to have the later version. So, this is probably about where they arrived. Here's the plain of Gennesaret and the Lake of Galilee. Again, Todd Bullen gets the credit for the pictures. And here you can see Magdala, what's left of it, and uh, other area around that. 654 and 55, Jesus can't escape the crowds. They went on a retreat and people followed them there. Well, now they have gone elsewhere, but people there recognized him. As soon as they recognized him, like they're getting out of the boat, hey, that's Jesus. Hey, everybody. So, hey, you want to be a celebrity? I'm not a celebrity, but because I've written some books, I get more emails than I can answer. I am so sorry if I haven't answered your emails. I can't. I am literally thousands of emails behind. I would if I could, or I'd hire somebody to do it. But anyway, there's just too many. And if I hire somebody, it's not actually going to be my answer. It'll be the answer of the person I hire. So the people there recognized him. And just like earlier, people ran to him. Some contrast the disciples who failed to recognize him. But, the visual stuff wasn't quite so good that early in the morning and out at sea when he's far away. But anyway, the needs, again, are unending. They're desperate needs. And look, if I had a gift of healing where everybody could get healed, I probably wouldn't be making these videos and I wouldn't be teaching. I would be, eating out of trash cans if I had to, instead of supporting myself. I would be going to hospitals and, I'd be doing that full time. I don't know anybody who has a gift like that today, but if somebody had a gift like that always worked, but only in person, I mean, one-on-one, um, so you can imagine lots of people are going to be crowding Jesus. I do know people who pray often and people get healed often, but wow, if it happened all the time. So you can imagine why people are crowding Jesus, and Jesus just pours himself out for them. Although, again, he does take his disciples and retreats. He does get aside to pray to the Father, but he's not going to turn away the people who've come to him. People are being brought to him on mats. Well, that already happened before in chapter 2. And to touch even his cloak, well, word had gotten around after that woman with the flow of blood touched him in chapter 5. And so now they want to touch even his cloak, even the fringe of his cloak. So this is about where we are going to end, but just saying a little bit more about the fringe of the cloak, the crospedan of his cloak. Matthew and Luke both apply this also to what the bleeding woman touched in Mark chapter 5. The scribes and the Pharisees, according to Matthew 23, made their fringes particularly conspicuous, but everybody Jewish was supposed to wear fringe. Well, yeah, everybody was supposed to wear these on their outer garment anyway. All of the uses, now the prayer shawl, all the uses in the Septuagint talk about this. So Numbers chapter 15, tell them to make fringes on the corners of their garments, and the blue cord and the white cord. And actually, I realized that in rabbinic literature before it caught my attention, even though I'd read Numbers way more than I'd read, any particular rabbinic source. And it was a rabbi who brought that to my attention. Yeah, that's in Numbers chapter 15, the different color cords. But anyway, Deuteronomy 22:12, make tassels in the four corners of the cloak with which you cover yourself. Jesus is Jewish, and people would be familiar with this practice. Zechariah chapter 8, it's understood that Gentiles would recognize that this was the way that Jewish people dressed. So people could recognize this as a Jewish custom. And everybody hearing Mark's gospel, whether they were, if they were already Christians, they already would know this. But if they weren't, even if they just heard this passage, it would be enough to remind them, okay, Jesus is Jewish. So this is not outer darkness and gnashing of teeth. This is the end of Mark chapter 6. So thank you for those of you who've tuned in to the second half of Mark chapter 6. And for the first half of Mark chapter 6, if you weren't in class and don't have the recording from the class, I did cover it in briefer form elsewhere. Thank you for being with us.